Witness the bloodiest chapters of history.
September 1941. The leaves had just begun to turn in Leningrad when the sky filled with smoke. For weeks, the people of the city had heard rumors of tanks in the west, of fire in the forests, of villages gone silent. Then the bombs came. German and Finnish forces had launched a full-scale offensive, smashing through Soviet defenses with terrifying speed. Their goal was clear: surround Leningrad. Don't invade it, just starve it. By September 8th, the noose was closed. All rail lines were cut, roads were gone, 3 million civilians were trapped inside. There would be no evacuation, no retreat, only hunger. The Nazi plan was brutal in its simplicity. Hitler declared, "Leningrad must vanish from the face of the earth. We have no interest in keeping a single inhabitant alive." The city was to be erased through famine, fire, and silence. For Stalin and the Soviet High Command, Leningrad was not just a city, it was a symbol, a birthplace of revolution, and it could not fall. But they weren't prepared. Warehouses held only a few weeks of flour and oil. The harvest had not yet come. The siege had begun before the people could even prepare. By mid-September, panic set in. Bread was rationed, first to 500 grams a day, then 300, then 125 grams. That included sawdust, wallpaper glue, and even ground-up bone. People stood in line for hours for a crust of blackened bread. Fights broke out. Neighbors turned on each other. Children collapsed in the street, too weak to cry, yet the city endured. Artists painted, teachers taught. The Leningrad Radio Symphony continued broadcasting with no audience, no electricity, no heat, only music played in defiance of death. In the south, the Nazis shelled every day. In the north, Finnish troops cut the last remaining routes. Leningrad was an island of frost and fire, but its people would not surrender. They dug trenches in parks, turned schools into hospitals, and waited for the cold, for the hunger, for whatever came next. This was only the beginning. The siege would last 900 days, and Leningrad would become hell itself. Winter came, and with it, hunger. By December 1941, Leningrad had become a prison of frost. Temperatures fell to minus 30 degrees Celsius. Pipes froze, windows shattered. There was no electricity, no fuel, no food. The average citizen received just 125 grams of bread per day, a sliver of bitter, moldy crust filled with sawdust, bran, and industrial paste. People began to die by the thousands. Frozen bodies lined the sidewalks. Mothers dragged the corpses of their children through the streets on sleds. Mass graves opened in city parks. There weren't enough coffins. There wasn't enough strength to bury the dead. By January, over 100,000 civilians were dying every month, not from bullets, from starvation. People ate anything. Wallpaper glue scraped from walls, leather belts boiled into broth rats, dogs, even book bindings. Cannibalism became the final taboo, broken. It began in whispers, then in arrests. Hundreds were executed for feeding on human flesh. The city administration didn't hide it. They issued official warnings. Parents, watch your children. And yet, Leningrad endured. Children still went to school, though too weak to walk. Hospitals operated without heat, without anesthesia. Theaters remained open. Orchestras played symphonies to empty seats, bundled in rags, surrounded by candles. One conductor died of starvation on stage. The musicians kept playing. This wasn't survival, it was defiance. Outside the city, Stalin prepared a lifeline. Ladoga, the great lake north of Leningrad, had frozen solid. Across that frozen hell, Soviet trucks began to move, carrying flour, fuel, bullets at night, under fire over cracking ice. It became known as the Road of Life, but it was narrow, dangerous. German planes bombed it daily. Thousands of supply drivers froze in their seats or drowned beneath shattered ice. Still they drove, still they came. It wasn't enough, but it was something. Inside Leningrad, starvation became normal. People lived in shadows, too tired to speak, too thin to stand, but no one surrendered. They held the line, they waited, and they hoped against all reason that spring would come. And when it did, they were still alive, but barely. Spring arrived, but it brought no peace. Snow melted into mud, corpses thawed in the streets, the smell of death returned with the sun. By May 1942, the city had lost over 500,000 people, and yet Leningrad still stood, weakened, hollow, starving, but standing. So the Germans changed tactics. If hunger wouldn't kill the city, maybe fire would. The Luftwaffe launched relentless air raids. Wave after wave of bombers roared overhead, dropping high explosives, incendiaries, and cluster munitions. No building was sacred. Hospitals were bombed, bread factories, schools. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to ash. The firestorms raged for days. Children burned in their beds. Doctors operated by candlelight as walls collapsed around them. Flames swallowed libraries, theaters, museums, and still, the city refused to die. In the chaos, the Leningrad Radio Orchestra prepared its greatest performance. They would play Shostakovich's Symphony No. 7, a piece written during the siege, smuggled out of the city on microfilm, and returned now to be played in full. But the musicians were starving. Some had frozen fingers, others had lost entire families. Still, they assembled, and on August 9, 1942, as German forces closed in, the symphony was broadcast across the ruins of the city, across Soviet lines, even into enemy territory. The opening notes, soft, fragile, then louder, fiercer, triumphant, art played in defiance of annihilation. The Soviets synchronized artillery fire to silence German guns during the broadcast. The music played uninterrupted, and the Nazis, listen, it wasn't a battle, it was a declaration. But outside the theater, the city still suffered. Fathers dug through bombed-out rubble for edible rats. Mothers wept over the graves of children. Civilians collapsed from dysentery and typhus. Fuel was gone. Heat was a memory. And yet, Leningrad began to resist harder. Small Soviet counterattacks pushed German lines back a few kilometers. Partisan sabotage increased behind enemy lines. And the road of life, the frozen lifeline across Lake Ladoga, now expanded with more routes, better organization, and desperate drivers risking everything. The Nazis had expected the city to starve, but what they created was something worse, a city of ghosts that refused to fall, a people who preferred death over surrender. Leningrad had become a symbol of madness, of defiance, of what happens when you try to starve a civilization into submission and fail. But the siege wasn't over. It would stretch on for another year, and the cost would only grow. Another winter, another graveyard. By late 1943, Leningrad had endured 2 full years of siege. The frost returned with a vengeance. So did the hunger. And yet, the city still lived. The German army, frustrated and exhausted, continued the bombardment. Day after day, night after night, thousands of shells rained down. But the spirit of the people was no longer breakable. They had become steel. Children born during the siege were now walking. Their first words were learned underground. Their lullabies were artillery shells and air raid sirens. They had never seen peace, only rubble, yet they laughed, played, survived. Fuel was gone. Wooden furniture, floorboards, even entire staircases were burned to stay warm. Families huddled in one room to conserve body heat. Water was carried from frozen wells, one bucket at a time, often under sniper fire. Still, life continued. Couples got married. Babies were born. Teachers taught without books. Doctors operated without anesthesia. The city, though starving, remained alive. But beneath the surface, the Soviet military was preparing for something bigger. For months, the Red Army had been building strength outside the blockade lines. Tanks arrived under cover of night. Ammunition was stockpiled. Sappers dug tunnels. Snipers watched. The siege would not last forever. Inside Leningrad, civilians whispered rumors. They're going to break through soon. And still, they waited. In January 1944, after 872 days of terror, Operation Iskra was launched. Soviet forces attacked German positions south of Lake Ladoga. The fighting was brutal. Hand to hand in the snow, machine guns freezing, men dying mid-scream. But this time, it worked. By January 27, 1944, the blockade was broken. The siege of Leningrad was over. Church bells rang. People poured into the streets. Tears froze on faces too weak to smile. For many, the celebration was silent. They simply collapsed in the snow and cried. But what remained? Over 1.1 million civilians dead, entire districts leveled, half the population gone. Victory didn't feel like triumph. It felt like survival. The siege was lifted, but the pain would never leave. Leningrad had endured the impossible, not because of strength, not because of strategy, but because of will, the will to outlast death itself. The siege was over, but the nightmare wasn't. When Soviet troops finally walked through the gates of Leningrad, they didn't find a city. They found a shadow, a shell, a place where death had made itself at home. Entire neighborhoods were emptied of life. Buildings had no roofs, walls were black with soot, basements were filled with frozen corpses, stacked like firewood. Children stared with hollow eyes, too thin to cry. Some had no names, some had no families left, just numbers sewn into their clothes. Soviet photographers captured it all, but much of it was kept secret, even from their own people. The world had seen bombings, destruction, soldiers in battle, but nothing prepared them for Leningrad. The scale of suffering, the depth of starvation, the fact that millions had endured this without surrender. The final toll was staggering. 1.1 million civilians dead, more than 3,000 died from freezing hundreds, executed for cannibalism, entire families erased from history, and yet over 2 million survived. They were never evacuated. They lived in ruins, they buried their children, and they endured. Many survivors never spoke of it again. What could they say? How do you describe digging through the body of a neighbor just to survive one more day? How do you explain watching your father starve himself so you could eat 10 more grams of bread? How do you tell the world that music played while people froze to death just outside the door? Leningrad became a symbol, not just of resistance, but of what humanity can suffer and still stand. Stalin later awarded the city the title Hero City of the Soviet Union. But for most survivors, the real reward was far simpler. They were alive, and that was enough. The city would rebuild, the dead would be buried, the ruins would be paved over. But beneath the concrete, the memory would never leave. Every alley held a name, every brick had heard a scream, and every family had lost someone they could never replace. The world would go on, wars would be fought, nations would rise and fall, but what happened in Leningrad would remain a scar, a warning, and a miracle. Leningrad survived, but it never healed. The siege had ended, but the scars remained, etched into the walls, into the streets, into the souls of every survivor. After the war, the city was slowly rebuilt. Rubble was cleared, parks reopened, trams ran again, weddings were held in buildings where people had once starved to death. But Leningrad was no longer the same. It never could be. Children who grew up during the siege often forgot how to cry. They flinched at the sound of footsteps. They hoarded bread under pillows for decades. Mothers avoided closed doors. Fathers sat silently at dinner tables, never speaking of what they saw. Some never ate in public again. The Soviet Union tried to celebrate the victory. Parades, medals, speeches. Stalin called it a heroic defense. But for those who had lived it, there was nothing heroic about watching your mother die on a snow-covered floor. Nothing glorious about boiling wallpaper for dinner. Nothing patriotic about silence. Leningrad became known as a hero city. But the title was not a badge, it was a burden. Because to wear it meant that you had seen the worst of humanity and still endured. In time, the world learned the truth. Historians uncovered the raw numbers, filmmakers interviewed survivors, writers tried to put words to things that could never be explained. And in those stories, the real legacy of Leningrad emerged. Not just the suffering, not just the resistance, but the will to remain human when humanity was being stripped away. To this day, the Siege of Leningrad remains one of the longest and deadliest in history. 872 days under siege, over 1.1 million civilian deaths, zero surrender. And through it all, the city never fell. Leningrad teaches us something brutal and beautiful. That survival is not just an instinct. Sometimes it is a choice, a refusal, a rebellion, a statement shouted through famine, fire, and frost. You will not kill us. You will not break us. We are still here. The city has a new name now, St. Petersburg. But if you walk its streets at night, listen closely, and you can still hear the silence, the snow, and the heartbeat of a city that would not die. The end. Dedicated to those who endured the impossible and lived to tell it.
Witness the bloodiest chapters of history.